On April 27th, 1813, the American Army captured York, the capital of Upper Canada. It was a hard-fought battle that nearly wiped out the entire Grenadier Company of the King's Regiment. At least 2 powder magazines exploded, and the sight of the charred and mangled bodies stayed with the survivors long after the battle. Many years later, an old officer picked up the Times newspaper and read a letter from Edward Finch, one of his old comrades, that claimed 110 grenadiers engaged 2,000 Americans at York alone for 4 hours. This officer, well, he wasn't too happy, and he sat down to write a letter to the editor of the Times to correct the mistake. He signed it simply, "Another of the surviving officers of the 8th Regiment." So, who was this officer, this witness to a pivotal moment? Well, 166 years after the letter was published, I've solved the mystery. Let me walk you through how I did it. First, let's take a look at an abridged version of the letter to find our starting point. 19 September 1860. To the editor of the Times, Sirs, your correspondent is in error. The Grenadier Company of the 8th was not the only one engaged on the 27th of April, 1813 at Toronto. The 3rd Company, under the late gallant Captain J.H. Eustis, was also present, both companies led into action by Captain Neil McNeill, who fell at the head of his grenadiers. 2 companies of the Kings were sent with some Indians to oppose the landing of 2,700 Americans covered by their flotilla of 13 sail. The 8th or Kings had 198 men engaged with some Indian warriors. Their loss was 97. The remains of the poor fellows lately found near the old fort at Toronto were those of the some 20 men, mostly grenadiers, blown up at the advance battery from the accidental explosion of the portable magazine. I was at the battery at the time with the remainder of the grenadiers and 3rd Company, to which latter I belonged. Lieutenant Finch was then in charge of a 2-gun battery some shorter distance from the advance one. The fatal accident led to Sir Roger Sheaffe's retreat and the destruction of our magazine, by which the enemy lost their favorite general, Pike, and 600 men. The force engaged, including 2 companies of the 8th, consisted of 1 company of the Newfoundland Fencibles, 1 company of the Glengarry Light Infantry, a detachment of the Royal Artillery, militia, volunteers, and Indians, in all about 600 men. 2 companies of the King's Regiment are identified in the letter. The Grenadier Company, under Captain McNeill, was resting at York on its way from Kingston to Fort George. The regiment was being moved to Fort George in stages by company, and it was simply bad luck that the Grenadiers happened to be there on that specific day. Alongside number 3 Company, there was also a detachment of men from number 7 Company and a few others to round out that number. So that's a good starting point, but to narrow down who the author could be, we need to know what officers were actually present at York during the battle. We know that Captain Neil McNeill commanded the Grenadiers, and Captain James Hardy Eustis commanded number 3 Company, but the pay lists and monthly returns don't tell us which lieutenants and which ensigns were assigned to what company. As you can see in this example, it gives us a master list of all the officers serving with the regiment, but not by company. So we need to do some detective work, and our next clue lies in lost baggage. The companies were traveling with the baggage and equipment they would need at their new posting. The morning of the battle, the Kings were ordered to leave their packs and greatcoats behind in barracks before engaging the enemy, and this included the officers' baggage. Once the Americans had pushed the defenders back, there was no time to get the baggage before the army left town and retreated to Kingston. So how does baggage help us with our research? Paperwork. Officers were entitled to be compensated on their lost property based on their rank, and a return or report needed to be submitted to start the claims process. And here's the actual return that shows us every officer of the Kings present at York on that day. Captain Eustis lost half his baggage. Captain Neil McNeill lost 3/4 and he was dead. Lieutenant Nuttall 3/4. Lieutenant Hill 3/4. Lieutenant Finch 3/4. Paymaster Kingsley 3/4. And Ensign Gregg 3/4. Most of their baggage was lost to the enemy. Now we just need to work backwards and figure out who was still living in 1860 when the letter was written. We can eliminate some officers right away. Lieutenant Edward Finch is obviously out, And as an aside, Finch commanded the remains of the Grenadiers during the failed attack on Sackett's Harbor a month later, and he was sent home with dispatches after the Battle of Stony Creek. Captain McNeill died leading the charge against the initial American landing. He was buried on the spot, and his bones were unearthed several years later when the lake eroded the soil and exposed them. Captain Eustis is termed the late gallant captain in the letter. After his army service, he became a justice of the peace and a sheriff. He died, though, in February 1859, 1 year before the letter was written, so he's out. Lieutenant George Nuttall, who was 26 years old at the battle, took command of the Grenadiers upon McNeill's death, but he was wounded at Sackett's Harbor and he died a few days later. He's out. Paymaster Nicholas Kingsley would die of sickness later that year during the blockade of Fort George. He's out too. So that leaves us with either Lieutenant Henry Palmer Hill or Ensign Alexander Gregg. Ensign Gregg was born in Quebec and joined the King's Regiment in 1812. He's only 19 years old at the time of the battle. A month later, he's wounded and taken prisoner at Sackett's Harbor. But his war doesn't end there. He has a pretty daring escape from prison, but that's a story for another video. Lieutenant Hill survived the war and became the paymaster of the King's Regiment years later, but he died in Jamaica in 1836, so it's not him. So the proud officer in his late 60s who sat down to write the Times was Ensign Alexander Gregg. He was witness to the terrible explosions and the carnage and the death caused, and would survive the absolutely brutal fighting of 1814. And at age 77, Alexander Gregg died on November 27, 1870 in Middlesex, England, one of the last surviving officers of the 8th Regiment.